Welcome to everyone to the Albright Institute's 15th anniversary public dialogue. I'm Nina McKee, the program director, and I have the great honor to welcome to the stage President Paula Johnson, Ambassador Ellen Loy, and Professor Stacie Goddard. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And let me congratulate you and the entire Albright Institute team on this event and on all of winter session. And that includes, of course, projects coordinator, Julie Lanza. Julie, where are you? And assistant director of academic conferences, Beth Robichaux. It truly takes a village to do this, and you've got a fabulous village. Thanks as well to our many friends of the Institute here watching virtually or wherever they may be. So hello and welcome to everyone, and thank you for being part of today's public dialogue, the culmination of our winter session at the Albright Institute for Global Affairs. Over the past 3 weeks, our talented Albright Fellows, 40 Wellesley juniors and seniors across all majors, had the amazing opportunity to grapple with some of our most pressing real-world issues. As part of this intensive, rigorous study, and guided by our faculty and staff, they presented on those issues in multidisciplinary groups. The results, as always, have been remarkable. Congratulations, everyone, for all of your great work. Your experiences as fellows will be invaluable to you no matter what path you take in life. And I want to say, with all of our alumni here, those paths are varied, and I think all of you can attest to that, to what the meaning is of this fellowship. This year's group of Albright Fellows have ushered in a special milestone, the 15th anniversary of the Albright Institute. And I want to say we are so thrilled this evening to have Alice Albright with us. Thank you, Alice, for being here. With this year's cohort, there are now about 600 Wellesley students who have shared in the transformative experience of being Albright Fellows. They make up a diverse community that will carry forth Secretary Albright's legacy, spirit, and her hopes for a better, more democratic, more peaceful world. To those alumni, especially those who took part in activities this week, we are so proud of you, and we are grateful for the many ways that you inspire our students. Secretary Albright was honored with a special tribute earlier today, and I would just add that on the occasion of this anniversary, we should remember the debt of gratitude that we owe her. The Institute and all that it has accomplished, the lives it has changed over the past 15 years, was made possible because of her life of service, her diplomatic achievements, her principled leadership, and her persistent belief that a better future is ours to create. The Secretary's blend of optimism and pragmatism can also be distinctly felt in the focus for this year's winter session, Negotiating for Humanity. That's a bold and even daunting goal in a world where more and more it feels like we've forgotten what connects us: our shared humanity. For all the challenges she encountered, Secretary Albright never lost sight of that. For her, and I hope for all of us here today, negotiating for humanity must be more than a discussion topic or a speech title or a study prompt. It should be a call to action, a call to center our work in peacekeeping, to ensure consensus and bridge building that should animate every goal, and to seek cooperation, connection, and empathy in all that we do. At Wellesley and at the Albright Institute, we're working hard to answer that call to help educate, inspire, and prepare the next generation of women for leadership in global affairs. There's no more fitting way that I can think that we can honor Secretary Albright. So now it's a privilege to introduce and welcome our keynote speaker, Ambassador Ellen Margrethe Loy, the Albright Institute's Distinguished Visiting Professor this year. Ambassador Loy has 35 years of Foreign Service experience, spanning multiple leadership roles in the Danish government as well as in the United Nations. Over the course of her distinguished career, she focused on peace building in volatile and complex environments. For example, overseeing the implementation of a peace deal in Liberia, and she is engaged in high-level negotiations with numerous parties and promoted women's leadership. Most recently, Ambassador Loy's diplomatic appointment has been as special representative of the Secretary General and the head of the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in South Sudan. Prior to that, she served in these roles for the United Nations mission in Liberia. A native of Denmark, she was previously that country's ambassador to the Czech Republic, and prior to that, Denmark's permanent representative to the United Nations. In that role, she represented Denmark on the Security Council and was also the chair of the Security Council Sanctions Committee on Liberia and chair of the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee. Wow. There's more. In Denmark, after serving 2 terms as the Undersecretary, first for the multilateral and then for bilateral affairs, she became State Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1996 to 2001, responsible for relations with Latin America, Africa, and Asia, including Danish international development assistance. Prior to her ministry posting, she served as her country's ambassador to Israel from 1989 to 1992. Shortly after she began her diplomatic career in the 1970s and 80s, she served as First Secretary of Embassy at her country's permanent mission to the United Nations, and then as counselor at Denmark's representation to the European Union in Brussels, eventually rising to the head of department in the ministry. A committed advocate for women and girls, she's also served in leadership positions for Plan International, an organization that works towards lasting equality and advances the health, welfare, and rights of children and girls in over 80 countries. Her service also includes advisory roles for the Industrialization Fund for Developing Countries and the Investment Fund for Central and Eastern Europe, and she was on the board for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, as well as International Alert, a global peace-building charity. Now, I went through all of that because Ambassador Loy's history, her service, her commitment to peace and peace-building and peacemaking has been extraordinary. And it has been a long and hard-built career. And I think you are such an example, Ambassador, for all of us here at Wellesley, and we are so honored to have you. So leading the conversation with Ambassador Loy is Stacie Goddard, the Betty Freyhof Johnson, class of 44, professor of political science and associate provost of Wellesley in the world. And of course, our beloved leader, faculty director of the Albright Institute for 3 years? 4 years. 4 years. Stacie's research focuses on issues of international security that include legitimacy, rising powers, and territorial conflict. Stacie, I just want to say thank you for all that you do to support not only the Albright Center, but all that you do in support of critical thinking, education, and the truth. So, Ambassador, again, we are honored to have you with us. And now let me please turn it over to Professor Goddard. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, President Johnson. Thank you all for being here tonight. I want to say a special thanks to the Albright staff who organized this and made it possible. To all those who support the Albright Institute, including the Albright ambassadors, to the faculty here, to the staff, especially to the fellows, thank you. To Alice Albright, thank you for being here today. And of course, to Ambassador Loy, that list, that was impressive. And that's actually where I'd like to begin tonight, not by recounting the list. We only have 45 minutes, but by kind of digging into your thoughts about diplomacy, and particularly diplomacy today, because you obviously have this incredible career, both with the government of Denmark and with the United Nations. Arguably today, diplomacy is in a difficult spot. We've increasingly seen not diplomacy, but recourse to violence, whether or not that's in Ukraine, Israel, in Gaza, just looking today, Iran, and Pakistan. Right. Are you concerned that we are now seeing countries turning more to the tools of violence than the tools of diplomacy?
Thank you very much. Before I answer your question, I want to say thank you to the president of the college and to everybody else involved for inviting me here this week. It has been extremely enriching to interact and to listen to the students and meet all of you. So I want to say thank you for thinking of inviting me here. It's an environment I'm not used to, but it has been an immense enrichment, and I want to thank you very much for that. And I hope I can contribute a little bit, and have done so. To your question, let me say that I'm now, and you can understand with that long list, that I'm now finally retired. And in my family, I'm known for being a news freak. They say I spend too much time in front of the television listening to the news. And when you do that, given the challenges around the world today, you do often get very depressed. I would also say that I get depressed by so many conflicts that are going on at the same time. And then I also get depressed that there is a tendency, and excuse me for those in the media industry, it is as if the media can only focus on one conflict at the time. And I'm getting back to you because you mentioned Ukraine, you mentioned Gaza and Israel, and you mentioned Iran and Pakistan. That must be something that has happened the last couple of days where I have not been watching news. I heard it briefly. But you didn't mention one, Sudan. That's probably the biggest one in terms of people being affected. So sometimes you do get depressed, but I have to say that I cannot and I never will give up the hope that diplomacy has to be used as a tool to deal with these crises, and the use of that tool has to be intensified, because I simply do not accept that, given the nature of those conflicts, that they can be solved by military weapons, because that will not benefit the people in those countries affected. So sometimes you get depressed. We are at a low at the moment, but I don't give up hope. I urge governments, neighboring countries to the conflict areas, and the actors to increase their activity in trying to convey to the parties fighting, listen, stop it, let's get to the table and try and find a solution where everybody can live with each other in peace. I know you would say, oh, she's naive, that's unrealistic, and so on. But sorry, if I don't believe in that, I could just as well say, forget it, and the whole world will break apart.
And you talked about the way in which, when you have these conflicts, the media often lead us to focus on one thing, right? To me, it also seems like as we focus on conflict, we start to not pay attention to what really are existential crises that are facing humanity, whether or not we're talking about climate change, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and not understanding what could possibly happen with AI, a migration crises all over the world. Part of the idea of this theme of negotiating for humanity is to try to put those crises front and center, to say that this isn't simply about one country versus another. These are about threats to humanity itself. We all know this to be true, and we all want diplomacy to succeed. Do you have a sense, how do we begin to get there as a collective unit, as a collective human society?
Well, I think some of the examples you mentioned of crises, I think we have to take them one by one because they're different. First, on climate change, I think it has taken much too long for countries all over the world, including in the Western world and in Europe, where I come from, to realize that climate change is something that affects all of us. But I think we are getting there. I think actually this winter, I don't know, I think actually also in the US, but certainly in Europe, this winter, with the higher temperature, the amount of rain, and so on and so forth. Even in my own country, they talk about how houses are flooded and so on, which never happened before and so on. People are realizing that this is real and we must do more about it. So I hope governments will listen to that. On this, and my second point on climate change is that, and I heard it here too, we hear it all over, the younger generation, they are much more committed to climate change than the older generations. And I think I welcome that. And I have heard many of you take up this issue during this week's presentations. I encourage you to continue to push us old people who don't think that is relevant for us to really take it seriously. We are starting to do so. I mean, just I see here, when I lived in New York, not even 20 years ago, we were not sorting the garbage the way we do nowadays and things like that. We are still eating meat, the elder generation. The younger generation are not doing it very much, but we are eating less meat and so on and so forth. So I think for climate change, you need the governments to be much more committed, and I put my trust in the COPs and those meetings. We just had one last year, and they really have to move forward. And I think what has happened, it shows that climate change is not only in Africa, where you have problems, or in the Pacific Ocean, where island states are in risk of disappearing. We have it in our own countries. So I hope that will encourage politicians to move faster. Weapons of mass destructions, I agree with you. If those who have access to the button are getting, you can get worried when they get in political disagreements, but on that, I really, really hope that they hesitate using that button, because that button would be destruction. Migration. It's a huge, again, I follow the news, as I say. I know it's a huge issue in the American political debate, and I can hear it's coming up for the upcoming election, but it's also a huge issue in Europe, and in my own little country with less than 6 million people. I think we have to be careful on immigration. We have to look at who is it that immigrates and why. First, there's a lot of people who immigrate or try to immigrate or try to cross the Mediterranean, which really qualify as being refugees, people who are fleeing armed conflict in their own countries. And we forget that many of those refugees are actually in the neighboring countries. It's not all of them fleeing across the Mediterranean. But there's also a group of, I don't want to talk about immigration to the US because I don't know about it, but there's also people trying to come across the Mediterranean, as I say, in order to create a better life for their families. And I'm always saying, when I was a child and grew up on the countryside, I did not know in Denmark how people lived in Copenhagen. When I started working on development cooperation, people in a village in Tanzania didn't know how people lived in the capital, let alone Europe or United States. Today, all youngsters have cell phones, and they see how people are living. And I can understand that they want to have that kind of life for themselves and their families. So if we really want to do something, we have to, first of all, focus on the conflict, so we don't have so many people fleeing conflicts and becoming refugees. But we also have to focus on economic development in the countries where many of the migrants are coming from. And I think in the US case, it might also be on the political situation, at least in the countries in Latin America. But I hear many Africans are now trying to come to the US via Mexico also, and it's simply because we haven't focused enough on them, those countries, even if they are in peace, being able to deliver to the next generation. And with modern technology, they know what they're missing. So I think, yes, we have to be careful we don't get too many and we can't take care of them and so on. But some can also contribute to society as our generations get older and older. I think we have to be careful and not sort of put everybody in the same corner and say we don't want to see any of you. I think we have to be very careful. For the sake of humanity.
I want to pick up on what you had said about conflict and the idea of attempting to build peace, and this really begins to delve into your own record as a diplomat, particularly your work at the UN. As President Johnson mentioned, you served as UN head mission both in Liberia and in South Sudan. In Liberia, you really had the role of implementing the peace. And I think that oftentimes when we think about these sorts of UN missions, we're really focusing on the peacekeeping or the trying to get to the peace deal, where you really was in the after and trying to make that work and implementing it. Could you tell us a bit about that process and the significance of it, particularly in Liberia?
Yes, in Liberia we were so lucky. Liberia is what I would call a traditional peacekeeping mission being deployed after a peace agreement had been achieved. That was the case for most of the mission deployed in the 90s and the first 10 years of this century. There was a peace to keep. So the peacekeepers, the soldiers, the military, the police and the civilians were deployed in order to keep the peace while the peace was being built. So we were doing, depending on our mandate, but there was a lot of things after a long civil war that needs to be done. The national army had to be rebuilt, they had to be trained and so on. And while that was going on, we were making sure that nobody came in from neighboring countries and created conflict. And we were there to sort of keep anybody who wanted to fight down and so on, to discourage them. There was, on the police, we needed a new police force to be trained. We needed to check whether the police officers had been active during the civil war and let them go and get new officers in, and they had to be trained and so on. So we needed to discuss with the government the whole question of the rule of law system and how you could get a police officer cannot function without a rule of law and a prison, even a prison and a court and so on. So we were trying to keep all that, everybody calm in the country while that process of peace building took place. We had, of course, before we started that, the very first task, and that was actually before I came, the very first task was to make sure that all those who had been active in the civil war handed in their weapons. So disarmament was the first top priority when the mission first deployed. That was done when I came, and luckily we did not have incidents of people with weapon. The lucky thing was that if somebody had tried to hide their weapons and bury them in the ground, the rain is so heavy in Liberia that when we found them, they were rusty and couldn't be used. So when we had incidents where civilians might have a dispute and started to fight each other, which we did have a couple of times, the weapon they used were not firearms. That was stones and machetes. So, we were keeping the peace while the peace was being built, which also meant working closely with the development partners, because you cannot build a functioning rule of law sector within the timeline you expect for a peacekeeping mission. It normally, if it's totally broken down, it takes up to 30 years, so there has to be somebody who carries on the burden when the peacekeeping mission is gone.
This is actually reminding me of an interview that I read with you where you were talking about the importance of both the peacekeeping and the peace-building mission. I believe you said that these are two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
So, and then basically the idea that what actually does happen if you only get one side of that coin?
Because then the peace we can keep the peace while the peacekeepers are there, but then we have to stay forever. So the goal of a peacekeeping mission, as I say, is to make yourself superfluous. Mm-hmm. So you have to focus on the peace building. And I was actually, before I was deployed there in 2005 and 2006, together with my colleague, the ambassador of Tanzania in New York, we were actually negotiating the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Fund that was established in the UN in 2006. The reason being that when you have to build peace up from scratch, and again, if I take the rule of law sector, policemen cannot function without a prison and a court. Okay. You can go around to bilateral donors and ask them if they want in their development cooperation to finance a prison. Not many likes to do that. It's nicer to present to the population at home that you're doing schools and health clinics. So my argument around with colleagues in 2005 and 2006 is, okay, there are things we might not like to do together, to do alone, but can we at least do them together? And that was why there's a peace-building fund to assist on some of those essential issues we cannot expect a government have money for right at the beginning of them coming out of war.
And one of the other things I think is really coming through as you're talking, and I know you've talked about this in other places, are the importance of engaging local actors, right? So you're talking about engaging local police forces, you're talking about engaging local judicial systems. How does that happen, right? Because certainly, I mean, the United Nations is a huge organization. Sometimes people almost see it as a faceless organization, right? One that kind of sits above everything. So how do you engage actors on the ground? How do you get them to trust you and officials? How do you get them to work with you?
Well, sometimes you have to distinguish. You have to distinguish with the UN. Because what is the UN when you sort of just say the UN? Who are you really directing at? Is it the Secretariat? Is it the UN officials? Or is it the member states? I mean, we can go back to talk about the functioning of the Security Council if you like, but there's some who say, oh, that's the UN. No, that's very often the member states, right? Secondly, I want to say that, I want to tell you a story, if I'm allowed. When I was appointed to become head of the peacekeeping mission in Liberia, there were many of my former colleagues in New York and sort of friends that said to me, oh, that's fantastic to become head of a peacekeeping mission when you have served on the Security Council. And I wasn't on the ground for long before I said it would actually, jokingly, I said it would have been a bigger advantage to have served in the field before you served on the Security Council, because you got more knowledge about the challenges and so on and so forth, which you didn't necessarily have just by reading and preparing for the Security Council. So that I would say that I have noticed there are changes now which did not exist 20 years ago when I served on the Council. Very often when they have briefings in the Security Council about a conflict and the situation, they invite representatives of national NGOs or others to brief also in order to get that perspective. But when you are in the field, it is absolutely crucial you engage not only with the government at the highest level and the president and the ministers and the police leadership, but that you go around not only to visit your troops and staff posted around the country, but you go into the villages. And our soldiers, they are doing patrols, but they are also going around in villages and sitting down and talking with the locals and to hear what's going on and what's brewing so that we are not caught by surprise. So that is, when you are in the field, this interaction with the local actors from the highest level to those at village level is absolutely crucial for you to understand. The worst thing you can do is just sit in your office and think in the capital and think, then you get to know everything. You have to move around.
So I'm really curious to hear you say more about this. In retrospect, you wish it were flipped, that you had been in the field before being on the United Nations Security Council. Could you tell us more about what would have changed, do you think, for you as somebody on the UNSC had you been in the field first?
And I'm a bit nervous because this is being live streamed, but I can tell another story because I think it was in 2010. The Security Council had a general debate on peacekeeping, and a number of colleagues of my, and including me, I think we were 2 or 3, I think, were invited to share from the field, come to New York and share our experience. And you don't know me, but have a little bit of a quote-unquote reputation, maybe not the best, of being frank. And I was talking about the mandates of the Security Council. And at a certain point in my statement to the Council, it was an open meeting, so it's known, I said that the Council had to have more focused mandates on the individual and not to have mandates that included everything. Christmas tree mandates, I called it. That was a bit of a shock in 2010, but I was very happy in 2018. I happened to be in New York to do another job for the UN short term. I listened to the Secretary General when he presented his proposal called Action for Peacekeeping to the Security Council. And he said, Christmas is over. So at least me talking about Christmas tree mandates had over 8 years resonated. My point being is, for instance, all peacekeeping missions have as one of their main points in their mandate, protection of civilians. And that's easy to write. But I just want to say, and you can all understand, how to protect civilians is different in a country like Liberia, where there's no arms, people have been disarmed, where the threat against civilians are from other civilians with either stones or machete, or how the threat against civilians are in missions where there's no peace to keep, where there are rebel groups or split in the army and weaponry on both sides. So how the mission is going to react to that and deal with that is very different. We cannot, copy and paste and say it's the same. That's where the knowledge of what's the situation in the ground is very important to be taken into account.
Right, and I want to turn to that in a moment and thinking about your work in South Sudan. Before I do that, I want to pick up on something. Certainly the United Nations is subject to a fair amount of criticism, particularly the United Nations Security Council. Various rifts between member states, and particularly the permanent members consistently vetoing resolutions. But I get a sense from you, both in your discussion, which UN are we talking about, as well as talking about the UN SE kind of narrowing mandates, that you still see a lot of functionality in this institution and a lot of reason to continue to invest in the United Nations.
Well, first of all, you have to remember, my experience is before the war in Ukraine and the present war broke out. That being said, I think the council is still functioning, but maybe not that we like to do, and maybe it's getting more and more difficult. But it was very difficult. Don't forget how difficult it was during the Cold War. Then the council hardly ever met. We had a very active Security Council starting in the 80s and the 90s and the first 10 years of this century, right? So now we are a little bit, but they're still functioning, at least when they don't disagree. And we didn't have that many vetoes either at that time. We probably have more now with the conflicts among not least the Ukraine war. But yes, it might have gone down. We are in a lower point for the UN than when I was in active duty. But I will regardless say if the UN didn't exist at the present time, we would have to reinvent it. Because we have to have more international cooperation to deal with these crises that affect human beings all over the world, regardless of whether it is war, climate change, or whatever.
So if I were to give you the United Nations magic wand, where you get to kind of just seamlessly affect change and reform in the United Nations Security Council, what would you do?
Well, I think we have been arguing for it for many years. We have not been very successful because the Council represents how the world looked after the Second World War. It doesn't reflect what happens today, how the world looks today. Everybody agree, but in the Charter, you cannot change the Charter and change the composition of the Security Council if any of the permanent members are against it. There have been two things in that regard, and that hasn't really been moving, but there are two things that should not be forgotten in this respect. The Ukraine war, I think it was spring to 2022, Liechtenstein, which is a tiny European country, presented a resolution to the General Assembly that was adopted without a vote. Not even the permanent members voted against it. So it was adopted, and that indicates that if a permanent member uses the veto in the Security Council, the General Assembly, which is all the member states, can request that permanent member within 10 days to come to the General Assembly and explain their vote. That, I think, is an important step forward, because then you would be up there and have to explain for 193 member states. There was another thing that happened in I think it was 2022, also the general debate, when President Biden spoke in the General Assembly. He had a formulation, I cannot exactly remember what it was, but he had a formulation that opened up for United States may be willing to discuss possible changes in the Security Council. But I haven't heard anything about that debate with the crisis in accelerating or escalating in Ukraine and now the Middle East and so on. Because the question is, you know, first the veto, and secondly, where is Latin America, Africa, and Asia? So, but in my time, we had a working group that was called the Open-Ended Working Group on the Security Council Reform. And sometimes when we were tired, we called it the Never-Ending Working Group. So sometimes you have to grasp any little sign of hope.
Absolutely. I want to turn back to, because you mentioned to the question of peacekeeping, and you mentioned different scenarios of peacekeeping and peace building. What you ended up doing as head of mission in South Sudan looked very different than what you were doing in Liberia, precisely because there was no peace agreement in place when you arrived. Am I correct on that timing?
Yes, you're correct. There was a peace agreement when South Sudan became independent in 2011.
Yes.
But in December 2013, the vice president and the president got into a disagreement, and the army split, and they started fighting. Then there was then the vice president and his people left the country, and then there was a facilitation and a new coalition government in, I can't remember, was it 15 or, yeah, 15, and he came back, and lo and behold, I can't remember if he came back in end of 15 or beginning of 16. In July 16, then they were sitting talking in the presidential palace, and their soldiers outside, the different ethnicity, different ethnic groups started fighting while they were sitting having a meeting. So then there were no peace, and now they're back. There's a temporary peace agreement. So, you know, that was very difficult.
And what did the implementation, what did your job look like there? How did it differ from what you were doing in Liberia?
First of all, we had a lot of internally displaced persons that sought refuge in the UN camps all over the country. So I think we had more, at the high point, we had more than 200,000 internally displaced persons living within our camp, with the disturbances that created, and also because there were different ethnicity is very sort of crucial for the conflict in South Sudan, and you know, the government sometimes liked us and sometimes didn't like us and didn't want us to move too much. So we had challenges all the time, because everything in South Sudan in the discussion was, on which side are you? Are you on my side or his side or the other one's side? I mean, it came from both of them.
So also thinking about a comparison, not just in the past, but in the present day. Turning back to Liberia, I think we'd say certainly Liberia has its problems, particularly poverty, but in terms of thinking about the peace, a relative success story. And in November of just last year, for example, a peaceful transfer of power in democratic elections. What do you think has made that peace relatively sustainable?
I think, first of all, the peace agreement. And there was one important factor that resulted in the peace agreement. That was the very strong engagement in getting the party to sign a peace agreement or enter into a peace agreement. The commitment of the neighboring countries, the regional organization, ECOWAS. And they have kept that attention on them. I think also The fact that they were disarmed, and there was, when the peacekeeping mission, the donor community was very supportive of them, they tried to move the economy forward. The elections were in November, the inauguration of the new president will be at the end here of January. So this is actually the first time they had an election after the civil war, the one in November, where there were absolutely no peacekeepers there. We had one in 11, and then when Madame Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected for the second time, and then we had the one when George Weah was elected, and there was a peacekeeping mission. It was after that election it was pulled out. So I think it was this hard work on peace, keeping the peace while building the peace.
And I think you're really getting this image, at least I'm getting this image of the idea that as you have operations that are keeping the peace, the importance of getting all of these practices that are so important for peaceful society, a democratic society, whether or not those are elections, whether or not that's economic development, all of that needs to come into place as people are keeping the peace. Shifting over back to South Sudan. Right? Currently, as you mentioned earlier, there is an ongoing conflict in Sudan. Began in April of 2023. And there are deeply, you brought up the importance of regional stability. This is obviously creating regional instability, including millions of displaced people, some of whom are moving into South Sudan. What concerns do you have about that regional instability undermining South Sudan?
Well, I would say that many of those who have moved into South Sudan are actually of South Sudanese descent. But I would not, yes, of course it has consequences, but I'm not seeing right now the political consequences for South Sudan. What I'm seeing is the security consequences for the countries in the region, because don't forget, first of all, Sudan is very big, and as, I don't know, is it close to 20 million people internally displaced or refugees in neighboring countries like Chad, Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Egypt, but Chad and Central African Republic and are not the best suited. And then the whole thing about humanitarian assistance, and I haven't seen the latest report from OCHA, the humanitarian agency, but the figures of who need food aid and who are in desperate hunger and so on is increasing and increasing. I know the regional organizations and the neighboring countries are trying to interact with the two generals who are basically leading the two army groups that are fighting. But so far, I haven't heard, I don't know all about the conflict, but so far I haven't heard anything progress. And I know Egypt is involved, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and others. I think definitely it is a case where there need to be mediators to bring them together to address the problems, because otherwise, and we have problems enough in the Sahel region with the military coups and so on, it's really something that cannot be overlooked. And the number of people and children that are suffering is unbelievable.
No, and
the climate already made the
exacerbating,
yeah.
And also, but to think about the importance, again, of those regional interests in either stabilizing or, as you know, in some cases, working to further destabilize conflicts, either for domestic political reasons.
Oh, I think the neighboring countries are all eager in getting a stabilized Sudan, and they were very hopeful until the fighting broke out and the two generals disagreeing. I mean, and even the president of South Sudan was trying to facilitate it between the parties in Sudan before this war broke out. And now they are in a situation that, the UN had to evacuate and so on. So there's also very few that can deliver humanitarian assistance if there were money enough for it.
I want to kind of telescope out a bit and think about your work, not just in what you've done in these conflicts, but your work through kind of the larger lens of diplomacy, and also spend a little time thinking about your work and the legacy of Secretary Albright, because I certainly, as President Johnson was going through the list, I was thinking about how much your trajectory in many ways looks like the trajectory of Secretary Albright in particular.
Oh, don't compare him with.
In particular, one thing that I've noticed you've done this work both at this governmental level and at the level of this international organization, and specifically not simply representing Denmark at the UN, but for the UN. How do those modes of diplomacy differ? Do they differ? Did they require you operating in different ways as you move throughout these organizations?
Yes, and especially if you compare my years in the Foreign Service, I mean, those I were working with on the internal lines, they were all Danes, right? And then we interacted with people outside. When I came to the peacekeeping mission in both Liberia and South Sudan, it was multinational. In both missions, we probably had about staff, be it soldiers, police, or civilian, from 100 different countries. So it was multinational, it was multicultural, and it was multidisciplinary. We had soldiers, in both missions, they were probably altogether, if you added it, between over 15,000, okay? Plus, and they were military, police, and civilians, and to get them to work together towards the same goal, that was not easy. And and then being a white woman from Europe, and especially a woman, I was told when my appointment to Liberia was being announced, it was just after a law professor for Ghana, a female, had taken over as deputy for rule of law, and then comes the announcement of me coming. The military headquarters floor, they didn't work for a day because the officers were asking each other, what have we done to the Secretary General since he's womanizing this mission? So, I'm just saying it, they learned differently, but of course it's a total different challenge. But I also learned that you should never look at that multicultural, multinational, or multidisciplinary as something that hinders your work. You should try and look at it and see how can it become an advantage for achieving our implementing our mandate, achieving our goal. And I tell the story, and I have told the students the story, when how we had something that was in Liberia where we had to calm some politicians who wanted to be president, 20 of them down so nothing bad happened. My deputy and I sat down, we decided we wanted to talk with each and every one of them, and we sat down with a list of 18 candidates and said, who's going to have the tough talk from the white woman from Europe? Who's going to have the African brother to African brother talk? He was from Mali. And who are we going to meet together? So my message is that people have a tendency to see this diversity as something that prevents you from achieving what you want to achieve. My message is see it as an advantage and utilize it as an advantage. Because, we white people from Europe, we don't know how to solve all problems in Africa, I'm sorry to say. And I think we have seen that not from the UN, but from the international presence in both Iraq and Afghanistan. For the coalition forces, I don't think we've succeeded that well.
I would agree. And one thing but this is in some ways, this is the message for those of you who know the Albright Institute of what we're trying to teach, this idea that in order to actually have these outcomes, it's required that you be able to speak across difference. It's required that you be able to work with people with different identities and with different interests. And you've told us it's required. Can you give us just a little more, how did you do that? I got from your story the sense of you need to know how to speak, when to speak, who is going to be more persuasive, right? How do you get there?
You try the best you can, and you try and adjust. I can't sort of give a recipe, but it was, it's no secret for me, it was a little bit difficult in the beginning. Now the president said that I had chaired the sanctions committee on Liberia, right? And then I come there as head of the peacekeeping mission, and then I had to interact with some of the people that we had UN sanctions against, and who had been active. I came there in 2008 in the civil war. The first couple of times I sort of looked at my hand to see if there were blood on my hand. But you had to interact with them because they were part of society like everybody else, and we needed to work for inclusivity. So you couldn't...
So this is another thing I'm going to pick up on, because this very much reminds me of something about Secretary Albright, which I was always amazed and impressed about the fact that she, in diplomacy, centered empathy, centered the idea that you had to talk to people, but was also one of the most principled people that I ever met. In other words, she had both the capacity to say, these are my moral values and I stand by them, and I can come and to the table and negotiate. How do you maintain that balance?
I think, I think here and now we need to focus on what's needed, namely to keeping the peace. Mm-hmm. And if there's then somebody who wants to take them to court or try them for... we had a story, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia early on that came with a report and recommended that some would go for international justice and things like that. It fell apart and so on. But my point was that sometimes that thing doesn't happen immediately. Sometimes it comes a little bit later. And I was always, when they said, there will never happen anything in Liberia, I don't know if they ever will. But I think in Cambodia, it took nearly 25 years before some of those who had been active in the civil war were actually brought to court. And I haven't heard anything recently, but 5-6 years ago, I heard there were NGOs in Liberia who were raising the question whether some of the warlords, all the way back from the civil war. So I think I had to concentrate on the immediate thing, namely no harm being done. It didn't mean that I didn't, knew that they had been active, and it didn't, was in line with my thinking. But I was not the one responsible for taking them anywhere. And I couldn't exclude them, because then they would make more trouble.
So in some ways, what I hear you saying is that you had a role, and your role in many ways was the pragmatic role. It was to create the peace that then might allow for justice to occur later on.
Yeah, if there was a will to do that.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one final question, and I want to turn this again to your career, and again thinking about Secretary Albright. Much like Secretary Albright, you have accomplished a number of firsts as a woman. You were the first state secretary, Denmark. What was it like to try to break into this role of diplomacy as a woman? And we have a lot of fellows out here who are concerned about issues of gender equity and diplomacy. Do you have any advice for the students here?
When I, all the way back in 1972, was interviewed for the Foreign Office, I remember one interview where the guy asked me why I wanted to come in, and I said, yes, this and that. And then he said, yeah, we don't have many women, so we can get more because they leave before we get closer up along the career. I never forgot him. I have to say my advice is to be yourself, to always be able to go to bed at night knowing that in whatever you had to do during the day, you had given it your best. Don't start being tactically thinking and saying, oh, if I'm going to solve this challenge I have been given, maybe I should solve it in a way where my superior would like it or whatever. Solve it and present the solution that you believe is the best, and then be judged on that. Because if you start being tactical, you lose your identity. And of course you shouldn't accept to be, pushed aside, but I think you should be yourself. You should be able to go to bed with a conscience that you had really delivered and not cut corners. And you cannot plan your career. I mean, if you had asked me 30 years ago, I wouldn't have known that I would have done what I have done. So you cannot think strategically that. So the most important thing is enjoy your work and give it your very best.
We don't oftentimes think, and oftentimes when we talk about international politics, about centering things like authenticity or empathy or principles. And one of the things that I always find brilliant about doing these talks and about working with the Albright Institute is the ways in which those fundamental values come front and center to international politics. Thank you for bringing that message to all of us, and particularly to our fellows, and for joining us here. Thank you all for attending this talk, this celebration of the 15th anniversary of the Albright Institute. And please join me in thanking Ambassador Loy.
Thank you.